Hello folks, this video is for mentoring sessions that I had conducted in the month of November of 2021 on TypeScript for Dataverse. It's a 4-day mentoring session and the agenda for each day is on the playlist in the video's description. The playlist has videos in a sequential order, so do check that out. Now let's get into it. To record. Okay. Probably we missed some things, but that's fine. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm using the different type of quotes here just so that I can paste it and everything. I don't have to use any additional concatenation like plus and do plus on each and every line to make things a little easier. And just do some you don't need the output, you just need the mapping. You need distinct if you want to change it to true, that's up to you, and then obviously no lock if you want to add that. Yeah, so now we have added retrieve multiple records with superhero, and then we have added our fetch XML here. Now if you see, the retrieve multiple record is actually returning you a promise like object, and it is of type async. This is what we're going to look next, is like how to work with async and how to use await. So whenever a method returns async, it's not going to wait for the response to come back if you don't use the keyword await or use dot then. Okay, so dot then, if you are using dot then response, and you can use this response and then do whatever you want. So in here you're getting the entities, you're getting the next link and whatever. This is still asynchronous, so what would happen is your code would finish execution and it would invoke this and then go to the next statement or end the execution. This then would only be invoked when the response comes back from this method. That's when this code is going to get executed. And if your next line of code is dependent on the response from this line of code, then you might want to use the keyword await. So instead of using dot then, you can also use await. Now whenever you're using await, your actual method needs to be a synchronous method. So that is what this error is showing us. It's showing if you're using await, then the main method where you're using the await keyword needs to have async keyword associated to it, and you can use this async keyword in here. Yeah, now let's just capture this response. So sh query and then wait. So now sh query becomes type of retrieve multiple result, and again hovering over here, you see that the promise like was of type retrieve multiple result, and this is that generic type that we are going to look into today as well. Like you can give whatever you want in that generics, right? But this is one of that example of generics as well. So now once we have sh query captured from the response, what we could do is we could log it in the console, and then can say query count plus sh query dot entities dot length. Okay, then the second one we might want to do is we might want to log all of the data. So first is logging the count, and then the second is logging the data as well. Yeah, so that's how you use the Dataverse web API. So let's go and compile. Without forgetting, first we need to compile before deploying. Okay, and then deploy. I'm not connected in here, so let me go and connect. Okay, now let me go and deploy. Okay, and same as yesterday, we'll publish the changes, and then okay, so now it's published. So let's go and refresh. Yeah, let's clean this up and try to change this to no. Okay, there's an issue, but I should begin with. Oh, yeah, I forgot one thing in here. So this, whenever you're using the options, you have to provide whether you're using fetch XML or whether you want to use OData. So that is what we want to provide here. We want to provide, and then it starts with question mark. So question mark, and then you're gonna say fetch XML, and then equal to, and then you're going to provide your fetch XML. So that's one thing I forgot. If you're using OData, I think so you have to provide OData, and then sorry, you don't have to provide OData. You have to provide question mark and then start with $select or that dollar symbols. That's what you want to start with. But if you're using fetch XML, you start with question mark, then fetch XML is equal to, and then provide the fetch XML. Okay. And then deploy. Publish. And then refresh. Okay, so there is the query count, and then you also see the data here as well. So because it's an array, that's why you get that 0, but then you can see that the alignment, the gender, the name, publisher, race, ID all came in here. Yeah, so that's how you work with Dataverse Dataverse API. So next is we would be looking at how to create like this method is now returning you that promise. Now how to create a method that returns a promise as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function, and function name is going to be delay, and it's going to take in milliseconds as a number, and then it's going to take in count as number as well. Yeah, so I have a delay function which takes in milliseconds as a number, and then a count as a number. What this method is going to do is it's going to iterate in a it's going to return a promise, but then it's going to add a set timeout. So we're going to add a set timeout for that particular milliseconds, and it's going to wait for that particular timeout and then return the count. It's pretty simple. So return, yeah, so return, first we'll do the set timeout. So set timeout just to see how it looks like. Okay, and then set timeout is gonna do resolve count. So return count, and then the timeout is going to be that milliseconds. Okay, so my set timeout method returns actually this should say count only because we are already returning it here, right? So set timeout will return the count for that particular milliseconds. Now this method right now is not asynchronous, it is waiting for it, which means this is synchronous method, it's not asynchronous. So if we invoke this method, what's going to happen is the function is going to stop for that milliseconds and then proceed to the next statement, right? But we want this method to be asynchronous. So to make this asynchronous, what you could do is you use this parameter called as, oh, not parameter, but the class called as promise. So what that promise does, it helps you make that function return the response in asynchronous way. And what it does is it tells you that wait for this method for completion of the execution, and then once the response is available, then resolve that response and then return it back to the method which is invoking it. So here we would create a new class called promise of type. So here you have to define what the type is going to be of the promise, whether it's going to be a return, what the return type is going to be, whether it is going to be a string, whether it is going to be a number, whether it's going to be custom object. You can provide custom objects here as well. So whatever your return type is going to be of that function is what is going to go in the promise. So in our case, it's going to be a number, right? So number, and then we open the promise, and then we copy this set timeout everything in it, and then paste it underneath it. Okay, now promise needs a resolve. So it has two variables or two methods. It has resolve and it has reject. Resolve means everything worked fine. Reject means there was an error, so now you're rejecting the promise. Okay, so here we just want to use resolve. We're gonna keep it simple. Yeah, so we use the resolve, and then here also we need to give resolve as well. Okay, where am I missing? This ends. Okay, set timer. There we go. Okay, so we created a promise of number with the resolve as an input, and then you can also have reject here as well. And then you can do, if let's say something happened and you want to reject it, then you can use this reject and then pass in whatever is going to be your reject reason. Okay, so that's how you use reject. Now in our case, we are not going to use reject, so it's an optional parameter. So that's how your delay function is going to look like. So next we are going to use this delay function in an actual function which is going to use this, right? So now delay, if you go here, it actually returns the promise of number, right? So it's returning a promise, which means it's an asynchronous method now. So next is we will do the function statement again, and we'll say dramatic welcome, and it's gonna be of type empty. And what this dramatic welcome is going to do is it's going to implement that that code, or implement that delay function. So it's just a simple for loop. In that for loop, it's awaiting delay. If I don't use delay here, if I don't use await, then the return type, because it is promise, the return type of this count number would become promise of number, which means at some point I have to use await. So that's why I'm using await here itself. And because I'm using await, what happens? The function has to have async keyword associated to it. So that is what I'm going to do. Quick fix and async modifier. So that added the async keyword here. And now this function becomes asynchronous. Now if I'm going to use this function dramatic welcome, let's use it in on change. It doesn't throw me an error here, right? Because the return type is void of type promise, right? But what would happen is it won't print the count because it's asynchronous. And if I have, let's say I'm putting this here, what it would do is it would execute this code but not wait for it to complete, and then it will go ahead and then complete this. And then because it has await, it will wait for this response to come back and then print this console. So let's check how it looks. Okay, deploy, and then going back here, publish, and then refresh. Okay, so now let me change this, and there you go, right? So the count came first before this got printed. Yeah, so that's how. But our dramatic welcome, which is this, all this piece, was before the query count, before the fetch that we invoked. But even though we had placed dramatic welcome before the query count came first because of the asynchronous nature of the execution. Now, if I use await, what would happen? Feel free to come out of mute and then try to answer the question. Anyone?
I think it will wait for the operation to complete.
Right. So exactly. And what would happen is this would reverse. So it would print this and not execute query until unless this execution is finished. And only then it would execute the query count. So always remember when to use await and when not to use await, and how your execution is going to be. Yeah, so we're going to keep that await. Next is going to be, so that is how the async await works. So next what we are going to look into is how to invoke an external API. So external API. So external API, every browser has one method called fetch. Fetch does your external API calls, and most of the browser supports it. But sometimes it has some limitations. So first let's look at the code. How to write a fetch XML fetch query. So for fetch query, I'm going to create another function and call this get Star Wars people. And what this function is going to do is it's going to invoke a call to fetch. So that API method is this one. Oops. So this is the API method. What it does is it goes and invokes the API and then returns the people from Star Wars. Again, fetch is returning you a promise. And what that means is, if it's returning you a promise, you have to use keyword await. Or if you don't want to use keyword await, you can still do then. So either way, if you don't want to use await, then you have to use then. If you don't want to use then you can use await. Now what happens in await is your further execution is stopped, whereas in then your further execution is not stopped. So once the response comes in, so you don't need to capture it here. Instead of that, you are capturing the response here and then execute and then working your logic here. And let's use then here, so it makes things a little easier to understand. This will be printed before the result. Okay, and then what we will do is we'll capture the response here and do so. Now with fetch XML, if the response is coming in as JSON, JSON is a separate method which also has promise. So if I do let people response.json is equal to response.json, then JSON is a method, you'll see that JSON also returns a promise. So which means here also we'll either have to use then or we can use await. So here we'll use await, and because we are using await, our main method, this is our method, this is the inline method that we have created, right? So in that inline method we have to use async keyword. So if you do quick fix and then do async, it will put async in front of it. Yeah, and then now we can do log, and then we can print people. Yeah, okay, so or maybe we can put it like this so it becomes easier to understand. So that is what our fetch is going to look like. So we have used then, so what's going to happen is this fetch is going to execute but not wait in here. It's still going to go and print this, and then once the fetch execution finishes, that's when it's going to run through this logic inside. So let's see how it works. Get star was people, we're going to invoke that method and get star wars people. Okay, now get star wars people by itself is not async. Reason? Because we're not using await keyword anywhere, so we don't have to use await here either. So we're going to compile it. And then deploy. Let's see. Publish. And then refresh. Okay, and let's change it. So you saw this here, right? So this everything now worked fine. So it got reversed. First we printed all the delay, then we printed the query. And here, as I said, the console log that we had, this one got printed before this console log. Yeah, so this will be printed before the result, and then we printed Luke Skywalker. Sorry, Luke Skywalker has the birth year as 19 BBY is what got printed after this line, and that's what happens. Even though it's returning you a promise, we used then to make it fully asynchronous, so we were not holding up the next line of execution. So depending on your situation, if you want to hold up your next execution because you want to use that response in further execution, then you can use await. If you don't want something to hold up the execution, the further execution of the logic, then you can use then, and then you can use the response and just process the response there itself. So depending on the situation, you might want to use either one of them. Okay, so now we looked at fetch. Second is we would look at one more thing. So fetch has some drawbacks, so let's look at what are those drawbacks first. So there is one more package called as Axios. Now Axios is not a built into browsers. So Axios is something that we will have to include in our code. It's a npm package. Npm is nothing but your NuGet repository, like how NuGet packages are. It's similar to that. We have npm as well, and we have yarn called too, but normally people use npm over yarn. So if you have npm, so you install Axios through npm, and then it will get added into your JavaScript. We'll look into that in a bit. But the benefit of sometimes using Axios is it provides you with certain things. So let me just change my cursor here. So it provides you with certain things like it does this automatic uh, transformation of JSON. So now we saw in fetch, we have to do two steps. We queried the object, or we queried the API, we got the response, but when we do response.json, we still have to do a wait on response.json because it's doing the two-step process, and that is what is shown here. We have the two-step process, but for Axios, it's just everything that we get is always JSON. Then Axios provides you to cancel or cancel the request, or even request a timeout, whereas there is no mechanism in the fetch that lets you do this. Fetch is kind of like a simple execution mechanism. Like if you want to just query an API, get a response, fetch is good. But if you want to do something complex to your API calls that you're doing, then that's where fetch would be behind, because it doesn't allow you to even intercept the requests, whereas Axios allows you to intercept HTTP requests. Fetch doesn't allow you to download provide you a download progress, whereas Axios has a built-in support. Like it tells you, okay, it's 50% completed, 75% completed, and then 100. Whereas Fetch doesn't provide you that kind of features. This has a lot of browser support. It has backward compatibility, it has forward compatibility, it has a lot of support. But then Fetch is only supported on certain browsers only, and also it depends on the version. So like Chrome 42 and above, Firefox 39 and above, things like that. Most of the time I have used Fetch. Axios is only when in extreme situation, when you need to do something with API calls, then you can use Axios. But I wanted to provide that option for you guys for using Axios as well. So that is what we're going to look into next, is to use Axios. So for Axios, we're going to do same get start was people, but instead of that, we'll say Axios. No parameters needed. And in here we would be using Axios npm package. So first we'll need to install npm package. So npm install and then Axios. You can also find the details in here. So that's the Axios package details. Come on. Okay. There you go. That's the Axios package details. And so looking at Axios, let's go back here. We'll be installing Axios. So once it's installed, what we have to do is we have to import that Axios package. So import. Now we are going to import Axios as complete package, right? So we can do Axios as Axios import star as Axios from Axios. So what we're doing is we are importing everything from Axios module as star, and then we are putting an alias called as Axios. Now you can change this alias whatever you want. Maybe I want to use web API, something like that. I can use whatever alias I want in here. Doesn't have to be the name of the module. But I normally like the standards are to use. Normally people use Axios as is, because then whenever you're looking at the code, you would know that this is coming from Axios module and not something else. So you have Axios. Now I'm going to call Axios, so that I'm going to use that um, that alias that I had used, dot default dot, and then I get all these options here. And if you see the options, you can do create, you can do deletes, you can do head, you have get, you have patch, post, put, request, whereas fetch only has one. That's it, fetch, right? So you have a lot of options in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do get, yeah, and then same get here, and everything else remains the same. So I can use then, but the output will be a little different because, as I said, it response is of type Axios here, right? So Axios doesn't have JSON, but what Axios does is Axios gives you data, and data is not a function, so you don't have to use await anymore. It's just a data, and that becomes easier. And just to differentiate, I'm going to write Axios here, and that's it. Now if I use this function, that is how we can use Axios. It looks completely like, it looks similar, but then the function is little different, right? With respect to, like, this is two-step process that we are doing here. We are already getting the data in JSON format. You don't have to do the two-step process here, because now you are using you're doing two awaits, first one to get the data and then other one to do the JSON um, transformation, whereas here you are doing it just once. So it's a little faster as well. Now, because we have used Axios and we are using Webpack, and we are doing import from Axios, we need to have this package on the browser, because browser doesn't support Axios. So if you want to use this, Webpack will be the best approach to go with. If you're using any third-party NPM packages, Webpack would be the best approach, because it does that tree shaking that we saw yesterday. So if I build this, and before I build it, if I look at the JavaScript, this JavaScript is probably what, 193 lines of code. Let's see what happens. And look at the terminal as well once it compiles, because now it's what it's going to do is it's going to go and look at that Axios and then include everything from Axios as well. So you can see that it went to that Axios module, it then went to helper, core, lib cancel, and then it did that tree shaking thing for you, and then created that one single JavaScript file, which will also now have Axios code in it. And now it became 2000 lines of code because it brought in that Axios code along with it. It's simple because Dataverse runs by JavaScript basis. So if you're using Axios and you're using one single JavaScript file, then you want that Axios to be loaded along with it. You can keep it separate if you want to, but then you have to make sure you are maintaining that dependency in Dataverse. Whereas here we are maintaining the dependency in the code itself. So either way you can do it. You can separate them out, or you can combine them together, right? You can go either way. So now let's deploy it to Dataverse, and let's publish it and then see if our output is shown or not. Okay, clear this. No. And there you go, Axios. And then look, and if you see, Axios printed faster than the fetch because it's not doing that two-time conversion, right? It's not two-step process, so it's little faster than the regular fetch as well. So next we are going to look at how to use generic type. We looked at some of it, but how do we use it? How do we use it in our code? So for generics, now let's say I want to create a function which is going to return whatever it wants, depending on whatever the provide or the function that is going to use it will decide what they need to pass in. So for example, let's say I want to do generics demo. The way we define generics in TypeScript is exactly the same way we define it in C#. So we do T. So T now becomes our generic type, right? And then what I could do is I can say this is going to be my arg of type T, and then I'm going to return T. That's it, simple. T, not text. T. Oh, not T, sorry, arg. I'm gonna return arg as is. I'm not gonna do any complex scenarios here, but I just wanted to showcase how you can use generics in this code. So this generic, when we are trying to use in our code, you say generics demo, and then here we can specify what we want. So we can say string is what we want to pass in, and automatically the argument now became string. Now if I change this to number, TypeScript is going to yell at me and say, hey, this is a wrong type. You are going to provide number. You said you're going to provide number, but you have provided a string now. So fix that, right? So that are some of the benefits of using generics. So you can use any instead of this, but again, we have to limit the usage of any, and that is why we need to use generics instead. So if your parameters or your response is going to be either string, number, whatever you want, instead of using any, try to use generics. Okay, so the second one is so the last point in today's session is going to be how to use Fiddler, how to debug your JavaScript. Now whatever we are doing here, everything is TypeScript, right? And then let's remove that Axios from here because otherwise the well, yeah, we can keep the Axios. So if you look at the JavaScript, it is now 23479. Let's recompile, maybe increase to let's see how much it increases. So it went to 2352 lines of code, right? And let's deploy this and look at how it shows up in the browser. And why do we want to use Fiddler? So refresh. Okay, so now if I go to source and if I try to open the file, so control P and then superhero demo, this is the file that we would get, right? And as you can see, let me just expand it, and as you can see, this becomes, you cannot debug this file, right? You cannot debug this file. It's so hard, like you don't know what request.abort is. You have not even used it. If you go somewhere here, you might find your code, but it won't be a nice experience for you to debug. right? So what do you do? For that, we use Fiddler. And one of the benefit that, if you remember from session 1, was we were using this map files. What this map file does is it actually has the information. So when your JavaScript files load, so JavaScript looks at this source map file. So source map file is telling look at maps folder and then go and look at this JS map file. And this JS map file has the information of the TypeScript file. So it's ultimately going and looking up the TypeScript. And why do we need that? The reason is it makes things easier when debugging. So in your Fiddler, first thing that you want to do in your Fiddler is go to Tools, Options, and make sure in your HTTPS tab, your Capture HTTP Connect and Decrypt HTTPS traffic is enabled. When you click on Decrypt, you should also see a certificate which you should go and approve it. And once you have done that, then the second thing that I normally like to do is when I'm working with web resources, I like to go and add a filter in my on the filter tab and then say use filter and then show only if URL contains web resources. Okay, so those are the things that I like to do. You can specify whatever you want here. You can even do your domain name here as well. Then we are going to go in the autoresponder. In the autoresponder, you're going to add a rule. And that rule, so this is a regex. I'm going to paste it in the chat as well, so you can look at the regex. And then that is the regex that I'm going to paste in here. So that regex, what it does is it goes and looks at the domain. So this is like going and looking at the domain. Then this is your prefix for the web resources. Okay, so that prefix needs to change. You might be using something else. I'm using POWM. So because I'm using POWM, I'm going to keep the same. But let's say you are using demo. So this would be replaced with demo. Okay, then you're looking at scripts because it's under web resources, right? So this is basically, if I go here and look at this, so this is web resources / POWM, that's my prefix underscore, then I'm having scripts as my folder name, then I'm having my file name, right? So exactly the same thing we are doing here. That path is what we are describing here. So POWM is my prefix, then comes script, the file name. This file name, fname, is a keyword that we can also use in the matching criteria. So in the match, what we're going to do is we're going to capture our local path first. So our local path is going to be resources JS. So I have to look at the JS file. So basically what we're doing is we are going to replace the JS file from the server with the JS file that we have locally. And then after the JS file, I'm going to use that fname from here. Okay, and I'm going to save it. So that is going to be my condition. Yeah. So now once I have that, I have enabled the rule. I've enabled everything. Now let's go on the in here and then try to refresh it. Okay, if you don't see an error here when loading, which means everything worked fine. Now if you open F12 and open the source superhero demo, now you can get the TypeScript file as well. See, so what that Fiddler did is it, instead of loading it from the server, it loaded from your local file. The JavaScript file was loaded from your local file. Then because JavaScript also has that map file associated to it, it went to the map file and because the map file is referring to the TS file, it went to the TS file and then loaded the TS file here as well. So now instead of you debugging that unreadable JavaScript, you're debugging the code that you actually wrote, which is your TypeScript code. So in case if I want to do onload and if I want to debug this, I go here, refresh. Why didn't it hit that? Let me refresh it one more time. Okay, let's do on change. And yes, and there you go, right? So the debug pointer got hit, and now you can start debugging as usual, and you can get all the data that you want. So section, you can do set visible, things like that. Any questions? I see one. No, there are no questions. So yeah, that was it all. Any questions? Let's open up for questions. You can unmute yourself and then ask questions if you want.
Like, is there any concept of threading in TypeScript?
Threading. I have not used threading. That's a good question. Let me get back to you on
Yeah.
that one.
And multitasking or
Yeah.
tasks like C# have tasks.
Well, yeah, you have background processes for sure. I have not used background processes a lot,
Okay.
but you have background processes that you can do, and probably it's like you're calling some API or something, and then you can use fetch, or you can use Axios too to do those background processes asynchronously,
Yes.
right? So that happens all asynchronous, so you can do that
Okay.
if you want
Okay.
to.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other
Yes.
questions?
Like we saw that you we did some changes on Fiddler settings. So if I do some changes on my TS file and then build it, and so the changes gets reflected automatically, or do I need to again do some settings in Fiddler for debug?
No, you don't have to. Once you have set up the Fiddler, once you have set this up, anytime you do any changes, so if I do any code changes in here, and one thing I have to do is just have to compile it, because it would then take the latest JavaScript file, right? So let's say if I added, let's add something here. So instead of hello world, I'm going to say hello superheroes, right? And I compile it. The only thing that I have to do now is go, I'm not deploying it, right? I have not deployed it. I go in here and I just refresh it. That's it, because now it's looking at the local file rather than looking at the server file. And if I go in the dev tools, and now I can see hello superheroes instead of hello world. I just had to do changes and refresh. That's it. Or compile. Do changes, compile, and then
Right.
refresh.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Uh, so to answer Lee's question is, when will recording be available? I'm hoping to get through the editing piece next week or in couple of weeks. So probably will take another week or two for the recordings to be available. But once they are available, I will send out that notification via email. So look out for that email. Also, I will be sending out an email for the survey. So try to fill that survey, and that helps me improve my trainings for future.
Yeah. Thank you, Danish. Thank you.
Yeah, I see Dinesh Kumar is typing something. So is that a question? I'll try to wait for him to post his question.
Yeah, I'll just ask it. Actually, I was thinking. So traditionally, we're doing JavaScript development for CRM, right? So how I think it will be a bit of learning curve to adapt to TypeScript for that, I guess, right? So how do you feel about that?
It's yeah, and again, I come from JavaScript background as well. I've been working with Dynamics for so long, and we have been doing JavaScript for so long. First, it felt overwhelming for me to get to TypeScript, but then once I started like small pieces of information, I was trying to do it in TypeScript, like at least start with small, right? And as soon as I got into it, I felt more comfortable with TypeScript than JavaScript because it provided me with IntelliSense, it provided me with types, it provided me with what I was doing in C Sharp. Same concepts it provided in TypeScript as well, which made my life easier, I would say. So there's no going back to JavaScript at all. If that's like if there's an option where I have to choose between JavaScript and TypeScript, I will always choose TypeScript. And that was this the training was all about that, right? How do you transition over
Yeah.
to TypeScript? So that's why I try to cover as much as basics as I can. But again, if you are having issues with getting onboarded with TypeScript, always reach out to me because this is kind of a mentoring sessions, right? So you are my mentee. If you have any questions in future, always feel free to reach out.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Danish.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Yep.